Today, I'm going to finish up explaining to you why a lot of the myths we have about the past and about the superiority of our own economic arrangements are really just that. They're myths. And so we've gone through a number of things that economists think of as constituting the good society, right? And one is this combination of low taxes and low social spending. We'll see that that combination has disappeared for a lot of high-income countries now, but was present in places like pre-industrial England, and particularly in England in the 1300s. Another idea we have is that we should have a monetary system which avoids inflation. That, amazingly, was the kind of system that many pre-industrial societies achieved. It's not the kind of system that in the last 50 years we've consistently achieved in high-income societies. The last issue about public management is public debt. So ever since the government began to be able to tax people significantly, it then raised the possibility that they could actually issue substantial amounts of public debt. In the pre-industrial world, when the King of England was only able to collect something like 1% of the income of the society in taxes, no one wanted to lend the king money because he had very little ability to repay. And so lending to the crown tended to be a very high-risk, high-interest rate activity specialized in by groups like Italian bankers, or there were Jewish lending groups. And it was a very risky activity where you periodically, the king would default, you would lose all your money, or there'd be a renegotiation. But there wasn't any substantial public debt in many of these societies before the onset of modern taxation. But with modern taxation, it turns out that governments can issue debt that people will buy in large quantities because it's secured by the power of taxation. And no one believes now, even despite the size of the American government public debt, that the government's ever going to default on that public debt. And when governments discovered public debt, it was a wonderful, miraculous discovery for the ambitions of politicians, because it seemed to be this relatively painless way of funding everything you want to do. And so in Britain, the huge economic change was actually in, the huge economic change was actually the Glorious Revolution of 1688 to 89. In the Glorious Revolution, now you had the unification of all power in Parliament. And with that unification, Parliament then was able to levy much more significant taxes and also consequently start issuing much greater amounts of public debt. And initially, that debt was actually paying returns of something like 10 or 12%, well above the private interest rate. But quickly, people discovered that this stuff was tradable, it was stable, and consequently, the government found it could issue larger and larger quantities of this debt without actually driving up the interest rate that was being charged. Yeah, guys, if you could investigate what is that? Thank you very much. As a result of this, by the 1820s, the English Parliament had outstanding a stock of debt which was almost 2.5 times national income. The capital stock of England in that period would not be any more than 4 times national income. And so the government debt came to constitute a very large element of people's investments in the society and a very large part of people's portfolios. And since then, government debt has wavered in different societies, but now in the typical OECD society, high-income society, it's typically 50 to 60% of GNP. Officially in the United States, government debt is 40% of GNP at present. But there's another problem, which is that now the official debt has no relationship to the real debt in modern societies, because we measure the debt just as the outstanding pieces of paper that the government has issued. but the government is actually contracted for all kinds of other obligations which are equivalent to having more public debt, but which don't show up on the balance books. And so, for example, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, these are all promises the government has made, promises that it doesn't have the ability to pay with the continuation of current tax rates. And so effectively, the government has this huge stock of obligations, and that's actually then a huge stock of obligations that's outstanding for every member of the society. Now, the question is, why do economists think that this is actually a terrible type of economic management? The reason is that what debt does is it just shifts the timing of taxation. Instead of paying for stuff now, what you say is, we'll pay for it later. Someone in the future will actually pay for whatever the war we're getting now, the health services we're getting now. It's just shifting the timing of tax burdens. If people were completely rational, farsighted, and also were completely interested in the interest of their children, then what they would do is, if the government buys something and uses debt, people should then invest an equivalent amount of money in a bank account in order to pay off the higher taxes that are coming in future, and to endow their children so that they'll be able to actually pay for these higher taxes that they're likely to face. And so government debt in that case wouldn't fool anyone, because all the government would be doing by issuing debt would be shifting the tax burden into future, but people anticipating that future tax burden would say, hey, I'd better save more for my old age because there's going to be more taxes in future in order to pay off these debts. In that case, as I say, government debt would be irrelevant to economies. It turns out, however, most people are completely non-farsighted, right? You're all economics majors, but I bet a bunch of you have not thought that much about the problem of government debt. Most of you have no idea what your outstanding obligation is at present in terms of the future liabilities of the government. And so most people pay absolutely no attention to this. And in that case, people will think of public debt as being equivalent to private capital in the economy. And when they invest and buy public debt, they'll think, oh, I'm just buying private capital here. And the argument is that public debt will then crowd out a lot of other private investment that would have occurred. And that the British government by the 1820s might have crowded out as half of the private capital stock in the economy by issuing all of this debt. And that consequently, since we see, and you hopefully saw in section, that one of the major sources of growth is capital accumulation, any society which accumulates large amounts of public debt will have a lower income than it would otherwise have, because it will have eliminated a chunk of the private capital stock. Okay? And that consequently, debt will actually slow down economic growth and distort the possibilities for output in any society. And that debt is the equivalent of, in things like World War II, large chunks of the capital stock across Europe were destroyed by aerial bombing. For economists, debt is the equivalent of large fleets of bombers flying over societies and simply eliminating a large chunk of the capital stock. Right? And that's why large numbers of economists in the US have inveighed against public debt, have called upon finally some kind of limitation to be put on this. It doesn't seem, by the way, in modern societies, debt fluctuates, but it seems impossible to actually eliminate this as a large element of economic management. And in the US at present, we're headed for another very substantial period of major government debt. I mean, the deficit of the government at present might be as high as a fifth of GDP, so we may add a fifth to the government debt just in this 1 year. And so a fifth of GDP to government debt in this 1 year. So that's a case again where that's a thing that pre-industrial world had. It's a thing that we fail to have in the modern world. And so you actually see that in all of these terms, these were not bad societies economically. The next thing that we think about constituting the economic good life is that people have to have personal security and security of property. Were these things achieved in the pre-industrial world? Well, I already gave you some data on murder rates in pre-industrial England, and it turns out that in the Middle Ages, murder rates are relatively high in this society. It's something like 0.2 per 1,000 people per year. it's relatively high, but it's not in the range where we think it would actually have a huge impact on economic activity. And we can do that by saying, well, how does that compare with modern societies? It's about the same murder rate as the Bahamas now has, or Puerto Rico. It's less than the murder rate in modern Brazil. And so if you actually go, there's a zone of countries in South America which have relatively high personal violence rates. Medieval England is the equivalent to a large chunk of South America now. And these are societies that function reasonably well economically. They achieve economic growth. They're not mired in eternal stagnation. And so it just doesn't seem like the fact that personal security is not as good as it is in the modern world for these societies, it doesn't seem like that's going to be a major impediment to economic growth. And in a country like England, by 1550, they had achieved murder rates which are actually lower than for modern America. And so long before you had the Industrial Revolution, in some of these societies, you actually had high degrees of personal security. The other thing that economists would want is that property rights have to be secure in any society in order for people to invest in knowledge or capital. Medieval England had a lot of peculiarities, and a lot of these pre-industrial societies had peculiarities associated with their legal systems. And what that meant was that there were sometimes complicated claims to pieces of property. If I bought a piece of property from you, I would have to ensure that also that all your relatives signed off on this transfer as well, or I could end up in court with your grandson claiming, hold on, I got a claim to that piece of property as well. Right? And so they did have a more complicated legal structure where you had to ensure that all collateral claimants to a piece of property actually transferred that property to you as well. But the interesting thing is, if we look at a society like modern Britain and look at the nature of property rights are actually severely constricted within modern societies by issues like planning controls, government rules, government regulations, right? So if you go to a town like Davis, house values are very high in Davis. It's surrounded by empty and largely worthless farmland. No one can build on that farmland, and no one can use that property in any free way in terms of housing construction, because that's all constricted by public control of property rights. If you go down, for example, in London has some of the highest house prices of any city in the world. Farming in England is basically an activity to make the countryside attractive to tourists, right? It's a very minor source of income. Mainly the English countryside serves for people visiting bed and breakfast and tourism and stuff like that. London is surrounded by a zone of farmland that's maintained by government policy. The pressures on developing that land are so severe because the distortion is so great between its value as farmland and its value as housing land that they actually have to have government raids on secretly constructed houses that are built in this zone. So there have been cases where people have taken pigsties and converted them into housing secretly. And then it's been discovered by the authorities, and the only way they can maintain that is they actually send in bulldozers to demolish the property if it's constructed illegally. But what's happened here is that you've distorted property rights to such an extent by these controls. I mean, the controls are designed for this good purpose, the idea that you should stop urban sprawl, you should preserve the countryside. But it means that actually, in the modern world, people deal with an incredible raft of controls in terms of property rights. It's not clear that it's any better than the set of property rights controls that existed in the pre-industrial world and the uncertainties that the medieval legal system imposed on these rights, right? I already mentioned that up until about the 1270s in England, one of the ways to defend your rights to property was actually by judicial duels. And so that if someone came and said, that's my piece of property, you could respond by saying, I'll fight you for it. And that was actually one of the standard methods of actually resolving these legal disputes. But actually quite quickly, they realized that, well, this has limitations as a way of allocating property rights. And they quickly moved to other systems that effectively operated like modern property rights systems. And so again, in that respect, it actually seems that, if anything, property rights are clearer in the pre-industrial world than they are for a lot of modern societies. What else matters to people in terms of having a society with a lot of potential for economic growth? Another thing that we would like is the possibilities of high levels of social mobility. If you've got a society where everyone is allocated to a station in life, if you start off as a peasant, a landless peasant, then that's how you're going to end up, then the argument will be, well, a lot of people of talent will not get the opportunity to use those talents, and that consequently a good society is one where everything is open to everyone. It turns out that pre-industrial Europe, at least, and also pre-industrial China, were actually societies of great social mobility. I showed you that already with the evidence on names, that people starting off in the middle classes in medieval Europe were ending up either at the top or the bottom of the society within 200 or 300 years. It also shows up in the demography of the society. London, from the earliest period, is a consumer of people. London is a place with lots of high status and important occupations. It has to constantly recruit people from the countryside in order to fill those positions. We actually have, for the 17th century, a pretty complete record of who was recruited into the guild companies in London, that is, into the craft occupations in London, goldsmiths, silversmiths, carpenters. We actually know, we have pretty complete records from those companies of who arrived in London, how they arrived there, and what their connections were to people in London. And the interesting evidence of that labor market is that it was completely open, that someone 200 miles from London would end up as an apprentice to someone that they had no obvious connection to in London itself, right? In modern hiring and labor markets, personal connections are often very important in terms of hiring people. Amazingly, in the 17th century in England, personal connections seem largely unimportant in recruiting people into these jobs, and the people coming from there are often people of relatively low status who are getting their opportunity within the city. And as I say, the problem in the city then is that they're quite likely not to leave any male relative. Then you need to recruit more people from the countryside to fill those positions in the next generation. But it's an amazingly open society in those terms. Within each village, in these medieval villages, often with the formal rules of serfdom, that some people are free and some people are unfree, there's widespread dispersal of land holdings. There's a lot of people with half an acre of land, and there's some people in each village who will have 80 or 100 acres of land. And we see again that in the village courts that some people are steadily accumulating land, some people are steadily losing land, and that these transfers are going on all the time in these courts. Every year in the court, someone is selling, someone is buying within these land markets. And so it turns out this is actually a society of complete social mobility. As the evidence is that potentially it had greater social mobility than within the modern world. And so you can't explain why it doesn't grow because of kind of everyone's fixed in some kind of rigid position. For China, we actually also have evidence from the Ming and Qing dynasties from 1371 to 1904, because they have this entry to the high bureaucracy that was arranged in terms of bureaucratic exams and various levels of these bureaucratic exams. 40% of the people in that period who ascended to the highest level of the imperial bureaucracy were actually commoners. They started out as people with no title, no distinction, and somehow through this exam system found their way into the very highest levels of the bureaucracy in China. It was also possible in China and in Europe throughout this period to buy your way into the official feudal hierarchy in these societies. And so that in China you could buy official ranks and titles, right? And that's again, we think of that maybe as, as a corrupt thing, but it's actually again a source of great social mobility. It's saying that not only with economic activity can you get money, you can also get into the elite and into the privileged circle in these societies. And so it's actually saying that money is super powerful. within these societies, okay? And what happens then in pre-industrial Europe is that the kings are always desperate for money. They can't get money from taxation. Another source of money is to sell nobility. So a large fraction of the modern nobility of Sweden, of France, of England were people who laid a lot of money in commerce and then bought their way into the system. And as I say, it just means that money is very powerful in this pre-industrial world because everything is for sale, right? In our world, one of the problems of high levels of taxation and meritocracies is that money becomes much less powerful, and the incentives for economic activity actually will decline if you have tax systems in place. In this world, money is very powerful, and social mobility is always present, and it's always very significant. The church, as a last element, is another source of tremendous social mobility, because the church recruits, again, from the ranks of commoners. A lot of the bishops and high officials in the church are people who come in who just happen to have talent, work their way up through the church system. One of the problems in the church, of course, is that you have celibacy in the Catholic Church period before the Reformation. Celibacy is actually in name largely. A large fraction of parish priests in the Middle Ages are actually have common law wives, are effectively married and having children. And so again, you've got this other avenue for mobility within this period. And so it actually, there's no distinction in between this earlier world and our world. It is a world of remarkable amounts of mobility. What else do you want in terms of economic opportunity, incentives, and economic growth? Well, the next thing that we think that any society should have is markets, and complete sets of markets. And you want markets in goods, in land, in capital, and in labor. How well did markets function in the pre-industrial world? And let me just erase this other part. The huge market, because people are living at this subsistence income, the huge market in the pre-industrial world is actually for food. And the biggest market in England is the grain market, and in particular the wheat market. And we can actually test, did this market exist? How extensive was this market? How well did it work? And the way we can actually test that is that for a group of villages, something like 100 villages, in England from about 1211 till 1450, we know two things. We know what the price of wheat was sold from that village, and we also know what the yield of wheat was produced in that village. Now, why do those two things allow us a test of the functioning of markets? Well, think about a world where markets really don't work very well. And what happens then is, if I'm in a village in medieval England, I produce wheat, I sell it to someone else locally, and it just doesn't move around the economy that much. Markets are very local, they're circumscribed, they don't work over distance, there's limitations on markets. What you would expect then is, well, if we have a good yield of wheat in the village in this year, there'll be tons of wheat, everyone's eating well, the price will be very low. If we have a very bad yield, the price is going to be high. And that what's going to predict what the prices are locally are, well, what happens in that particular village. And the way to think about this is, imagine we had a group of islands, each of which are isolated from the others, and they're all producing wheat, and everything that's produced is consumed in one of those islands. Then what would be the predictor of what prices are here would be, well, how much did we harvest in these villages, in these islands? Suppose, on the other hand, there was a completely functional market in this world. The goods moved around the economy easily. There are very few barriers to movement. In that case, if I want to know the price of wheat in any village in England, inquiring about the local yield would tell me nothing. It's going to depend on what's the national yield, and more particularly, the local price will be completely predicted by what's the national price of wheat, right? That's all the information about yields and about supply and demand will be incorporated in that national price. And once I know that, I'll have the best predictor of the local price. And knowing what the local yield is will not be of any information. And the equivalent now would be, if I want to know the price of tomatoes in Davis, I could go out to the fields outside Davis and say, to ask the farmer, what's the yield this year, right? But alternatively, I could just look at what's the national price for tomato, or the California price for tomatoes. That's going to tell me all the information I need to know, right? Knowing what the local harvest was in tomatoes, it would be, in the absence of this other information, it would be useful. But once I know the price, I'll know everything, right? And so we can actually test how well did these markets work in England from 1211 up to 1450 by just looking at, if I want to predict the local price, so the price in place I, what's the better predictor? Is it the yield in place I, or is it the national price? So P bar is the national price of wheat. You've got the local yield. What is it that actually is going to predict what prices are? And the answer for these 100 villages is that in every one of them, it's the national price that is actually the overwhelming predictor of what the price of wheat will be. In a few of them, in something like 5%, there's some sign that you get a little bit of extra information by knowing as well what the local yield is. But it turns out that wheat prices in England in 1211 at the local level are determined in some kind of national market. That you've already got national markets in produce well back into the Middle Ages, and it's not an absence of things like goods markets. And the way this market, by the way, it shows up is London is a huge consumer of food. And so a lot of this wheat that's being produced is actually being shipped into London. The London market is organized enough that you can actually rent storage space in granaries to store wheat by the week. And so it's like rental centers now or something like that, or these storage places that people are actually storing wheat. There's a rental market. We can calculate the cost of storing wheat. The market is not perfect in terms of the year-to-year fluctuations of prices are higher than would be consistent with an absence of profits in the market. But it's there. It's pretty functional, and it's long distance, and it's pretty well organized. And so there's no absence of markets for goods in this early society. And we have markets now in the modern world that are also pretty free. What about land? Again, we can see in the village courts tremendous amounts of transactions in the local land market. There's no shortage of people's ability to accumulate land, get rid of land. These markets in the towns, houses are sold and traded between various people. All of these markets exist. Now, in somewhere like England in 2000, the land market is actually quite problematic because of, as I say, there are lots of restrictions on what people can do with land in modern societies that didn't exist in this earlier world. Capital. What about capital? One of the popular misconceptions is that usury laws actually largely restricted capital markets in the pre-industrial world. Very large numbers of pre-industrial societies had quite stringent theoretical restrictions on lending at interest. And in the Catholic tradition, it was based on a theological conception that money was sterile. Money didn't do anything. Consequently, it could not be a fair bargain if I give you $100 for a year and then expect to get more than $100 back. Because money was not productive, it shouldn't have produced anything, and so how could I actually charge more by lending money and in terms of getting it back? In the Islamic tradition, again, usury is banned, so it's a common feature of some pre-industrial societies that they have these significant restrictions, right? Another thing we learn, though, is through history is people's ingenuity in getting around theological limitations on activity is actually quite astonishing. And so in medieval Europe, there were actually a group of clerics who earned a lot of money and status by their ability to figure out why any capital transaction was actually not usurious, but actually was quite legal and legitimate within the bounds of the church. If you committed usury, that was a mortal sin in Catholic doctrine and condemned you to the fires of hell. Okay? And so you wanted to avoid, if possible, for the safety of your soul, from committing the sin of usury. But there were these clerics who could actually figure out for most transactions why these were not usurious. It turns out now in the Islamic world, there's a group of Islamic clerics who advise bankers in terms of constructing capital transfers in such a way that they actually meet the prescriptions of the Islamic faith. And they're actually quite highly paid. So in places like London, there are these group of specialists who actually advise banks, banking for the Muslim world, on how you can structure the transactions in such a way that even though interest is actually being paid, it will not be a usurious transaction within these banks. So how did they do it in medieval Europe? Well, you can't lend money at interest and get something back, but you could charge a premium if there was a risk that you wouldn't get all of your money back. Then the payment would not be interest. It would actually be a payment for your risk. Consequently, if you took out an equity stake in any enterprise, it was absolutely permissible to receive a return for an equity stake. So equity finance is fine, right? Partnerships for trade, all of that stuff is fine in the medieval period. One of the ways that people actually borrowed and lent in this market was through annuities. That is that if I'm old and I want to take care of myself in my old age, I can take my money and I can pay it over to, say, a German medieval city, and they will guarantee me a payment until I die. Right? That involves an interest payment, right? What that money is doing is it's being invested in land or housing. It's then paying a return, and then I'm paying out some of that to the investors. But that was perfectly legal under church doctrine because it was uncertain the date at which I would die. If I lived for a very long time, then the person getting the payment would actually end up paying more than I had paid in and would lose from the transaction. Consequently, you could justify the payment as a reflection of the risks of that transaction. Or similarly, from the payee's perspective, when I buy the annuity, if I die within a year, I will not get all of my money back. And so consequently, the interest payment or the rental payment is actually a compensation for that risk that's involved in the transaction. So annuities existed in the medieval world and were quite legal. Equity partnerships were legal. Another thing was that it was permissible to collect a return from land because land was productive. It was a productive good, and so if I gave you land for a year, then it was quite permissible to collect a return on that, right? What they then thought of was, well, suppose I didn't give you land, suppose instead I bought some of the rent of that land into the future. And so what they permitted were things called rent charges, which were, instead of buying land outright, I would go to an owner of a field and say, I'll pay you $100 for part of the rent of that land in future. Then the owner would pay me, in the medieval period, 10% a year on that payment forever. That looks like it's just a regular interest rate capital transaction. It's legal under church doctrine because it's secured by the land. I'm actually buying the land rent. And since land rent is fine, buying it in advance is also fine. And so that's permissible. And they could do this with housing as well, but also with things like toll bridges or anything that generated income. You could sell off part of that income advance. And so basically it said any kind of secured lending is perfectly legal. And in fact, the church was a major participant in those markets because the church in the medieval period, the Catholic Church, was getting huge donations from people to protect their eternal soul. So it was gradually accumulating more and more of the property of these societies, and consequently, it was a huge player in the capital market because of these investments it received and needed to invest them in something. And so the church actually bought up a lot of these rent charges from people. So that's also permissible. The next thing is that if you lend in one currency and get paid back in another currency, because these currencies fluctuated, it was again permissible to effectively have an interest payment because there was a risk that you wouldn't get all of your money back. right? And so the risk payment was a premium for that risk that you were undertaking. Even better, it turns out that you could lend in pounds and get paid back in livres, right? Now, there is a risk that's involved in that because of the exchange rate fluctuation, but at the same time, you could arrange a contract in livres that would pay you back in pounds, and you could enter into both of these contracts. And by doing that, you can eliminate the currency risk, right? Because if the livre moves up relative to the pound, if you get the same contracts, if it's 100 pounds going into livres, 100 livres going into, 100 pounds worth of livres into pounds, each with its associated interest payment, any movement of the relative value of the currencies is completely offset. What you lose on one contract, you gain on the other. So you can arrange perfectly risk-free interest transactions which were completely legal under church doctrine. Because the church fathers ruled you have to look at each individual transactions. The fact that you can put them together in this way with complete offset was not regarded as creating usury. It's the individual transaction that has to be examined for usury. And so it turns out, as I say, if you look at the rules of this society, you would say we absolutely have banned usury within medieval Europe. It's almost impossible to think of a transaction that you couldn't actually engage in. The only thing that's actually forbidden is short-term unsecured lending to people where it's just, I give you 100 pounds and then next year you have to give me back 120, right? That was banned. But here, conveniently for medieval Catholic Europe, you had the Jews. Because lending, usury is not forbidden under Jewish theology. And consequently, what would actually happen is that the Jews in medieval cities would engage in that sector of the market. It made them very unpopular. It was one of the reasons they were unpopular. But the cities could actually get a lot of the benefits from this market because they simply taxed the moneylenders. Consequently, they did not commit the sin of usury, but they had this sector of the market completely covered and got a lot of the profit from that sector. And so, as I say, there's absolutely no restrictions on credit markets, essentially, in this period. In the period, in the high finance sector, lending to kings, what would happen there is that the kings would actually, they wouldn't even, they didn't have to obey the church doctrines, but then before you died, you would confess, make some payment to the church, and get the sin wiped out. And so there was another route as well, which is because of the possibilities of absolution, where you could simply defy the doctrine, and then at the end, you could actually make yourself whole with God again. And so it turns out that they had complete capital markets. We have complete capital markets. What about labor markets in this early world? I already mentioned that there's complete kind of mobility of people. There's also a surprising degree of geographic mobility in this world. And that's important in terms of, again, if we're thinking of technological advance, because remember, there is this idea that a society is going to grow if you can get the ideas of other people, right? That an idea that's produced, you want it to move quickly from one place to another. So now, instantly, if something is discovered in China or in America, the whole of the world knows about that almost instantly, right? And in fact, as a result of that, there's actually an interesting derivative economic theorem. Don't tell you that I don't tell you useful things about conducting your lives, right? And here's a question, and it's actually posed in economics. If you go to a town and there's a local specialty, should you get the local specialty when you go to a restaurant? And the argument of economists is no. You never want the local specialty, because if it's any good, why is it just the local specialty? Why doesn't everyone have it already, right? And so a similar idea applies to the thought of a world where ideas are very mobile will be one where good ideas essentially get adopted unless there's some local ingredient you can't duplicate elsewhere. Good ideas, you want to travel quickly, and one of the carriers of ideas are people moving from one society to the other. And how do we, but it turns out that there's actually, in this period where people have to walk typically to get from one place to the other, or else go in shipping that is quite dangerous given the conditions of ships in that period, it's amazing how mobile people are. And one of the ways we know this, for example, in 1292 in Paris, there was a tax on all households imposed by the king. Philip the Fair. And it's imposed on commoners in Paris. And that tax revealed that 6% of the population of Paris in that period was actually foreigners. And of the foreigners, the most common group were 2.1% of the people in Paris were actually English. And so as the very early periods, you actually get this mobility. Who are the other people in Paris? There's Italians, Germans, Flemish, Jews, Scots. There's a very substantial population, and a lot of these guys are artisans, craftsmen, people with skills who've been imported because of the skills that they bear from some other society. Similarly, in London, the Crown imposed a tax on aliens in 1440. 10% of the male population of London in that period was actually from outside England. And that's just the ones who weren't naturalized already, because if you arrived early enough, then you could take on British citizenship. And so we know that the major cities in Europe in this period are full of people who've come from other societies. And as I say, this is surprising because you can't just hop on a plane in this period and go from Paris to London. We have the records of Hamburg, and Hamburg is about 1,500 miles from Rome. In the medieval period, they would send out messengers periodically to Rome or to other cities across Europe. How did they send that? They sent people on foot. There was a professional guild of message bearers whose job would be to walk across the Alps to Rome and back. And they didn't send horses because it turns out that horses actually don't travel that well if you have to go long distances. You have to have horses changed constantly. And so the technology they were actually using is you walk, right? And so someone would say, okay, here's a message for the Pope. And you would actually transmit that across these different countries in Europe in that period. And so it is actually a world where, in that sense, people are astonishingly adventurous in this period. How good are labor markets now? Again, there actually are worries about the operation of labor markets within modern high-income economies, because we have imposed incredible numbers of restrictions in terms of getting rid of people. And what that makes is that employers are actually very reluctant often to take on new workers, because it's so difficult in times of downturn to actually eliminate workers in countries like Europe. America is still the land of hire and fire. But in countries like Europe, there are lots and lots of restrictions on how you remove people, who you remove. The legal system is full of cases about, was I justly fired, was I not justly fired? This is not a problem that the medieval world had. Hiring was at will in this world. And so actually what we see is that it's a rich economic world, right? This is medieval Europe. We think China would be very similar in these periods. This is a world of incredible complexity, astonishing variety. It's not the picture that you would get by looking at something like Braveheart. Okay? And in terms of capital, the one thing I forgot to mention here is that the Muslim world had the same problem of interest, that you couldn't lend at interest. They had a completely different device, but again quite ingenious in order to do this, which was the method of the double sale. And so what happened in the double sale is, I want to lend you £100 and collect £10 of interest. I can't do that. Whoops. What happened here? Whoop, there we go. I can't do that legally. So instead what would happen is you would enter into a double transaction. I lend you £100, and the contract is you pay me £100 again. I sell you a worthless trinket, a small piece of cloth, for £10 at the same time. That makes the transaction legal, right? Because again, it's the coupling doesn't matter. Each one, you just look at that on its own. What actually even happened in places like the Ottoman Empire was the Muslim courts enforced usurious contracts. After a while, they didn't even worry about that. They would actually enforce in the courts doctrines that were actually against the doctrines of Islam, contracts that were against the doctrines of Islam, and it didn't seem to trouble them, right? And it was justified, I think, by some argument of public good, that this transaction was in the public interest. And so we think that all of these societies are likely to display a high degree of ingenuity. The market is a pervasive beast, right? It's very hard to suppress the market. It's very difficult to stop people trading and to stop people finding ways to trade in these early societies. And what you actually see here is a high degree of enterprise and mobility, and surprising degree of enterprise and mobility. And as I say, the puzzle it creates for us is this society had everything except economic growth, right? It had all of the rest of what we think we need, except they just couldn't achieve economic growth. And that's why the puzzle is so enduring about the Industrial Revolution, because the easy answers, right, the ones that a lot of people assume are going to be the answers, they just don't work, right? The last thing that we have to worry about is to get growth, what we're going to see is that a key element is the production of knowledge. Okay? And knowledge is a very tricky good in any society because it's quite difficult to define the right to knowledge. It's totally going to depend on a legal system, right? Otherwise, the only thing you've got is secrecy, right? And so in the medieval period, for example, if someone wrote a manuscript, if Stephen King was to have written one of his works in 1300, how much money would he have earned from that? The answer is zero. And the reason is the method of producing manuscripts was just for someone to copy it. As soon as he sold one copy, then you could call in other people and get to work copying that, and the copyists, the illegal infringers, could produce the good at exactly the same price that Stephen King could produce it. And consequently, there was no possibility from profit from things like book production, other kinds of knowledge. We know if you go back to the Greek period or the Roman period, there's no legal protection for these types of knowledge. In the medieval period, there's very, very limited legal protection. It has to just depend on a grant by the king of some kind of protection in most of Europe. And so the one argument that people have then made is, could it be that it's purely this problem of the production of knowledge? We've developed, actually, in our society, very strong defenses of knowledge. And in fact, now the argument of many economists is that we've gone entirely too far, that we've given knowledge producers absolutely too much protection. One problem, for example, in book publication is that they keep extending the period of copyright, right? The author's copyright and their descendants. And we also have that in films, movies, art. We've got these incredibly extended periods of copyright. And why is that happening? It turns out a lot of it has to do with Mickey Mouse. Disney does not want Mickey Mouse to go out of copyright or of copyright protection, right? Because they want to hold on to these property rights. They're powerful lobbyists within the US Congress. They're going to keep extending this forever, right? And the argument is that that's way beyond the amount that you need to reward people for innovation, and that there's a social loss then, right? That is that you can't reproduce Google now would like to basically put on the web the entire stock of book publication in the US. But one of the problems is that it's having to battle with the fact that a lot of these are still under copyright, but you can't even find the copyright owners. They've disappeared. The book hasn't been published in 50 years, but it's still protected. And that consequently, you're interfering with the operation of these markets. Similarly, with drugs, with other things like this, the argument has been that we've actually moved to too strong a protection. But the interesting thing is that the pre-industrial world actually had very, very limited protections. And so the last kind of redoubt of economists thinking that this is just a function of institutions is this idea that these societies just made one crucial mistake, which is that they didn't think to reward knowledge, right? And that's what was impeding them. And next time we're going to want to talk about Chapter 9. But at the beginning, let me just say a little bit about, is that plausible as an account of what held down world growth for 100,000 years, was just this issue about knowledge.